Hello friends, I won't take much of your time. I just ask you to subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
I'll be managing Dad's company now, Brad said, straightening his suit jacket like he was about to step into a boardroom, not the goddamn chapel where our father's casket still sat untouched. His voice cut through the murmurs of the after-service gathering like a blade. There were still people holding tissues. The coffee urn was hissing. I saw 3 of our contractors in the back, still wearing work boots, out of respect. And yet Brad, my older brother, the golden boy, the one everyone always said looked just like Dad, stood there in front of our family like the ink on the obituary was a green light to take over everything. Nobody flinched. Not Mom, not Uncle Ray, not even the pastor, who just nodded and placed a hand on Brad's shoulder like he was congratulating him. It was disgusting, but not surprising, because Brad always had this way of taking center stage, especially when it wasn't his to take. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I watched him soak in the attention, already talking to the accountant, making plans like we weren't in a room that smelled like carnations and death. I sat quietly in the front row, my fingers folded in my lap like I was still 12, still waiting for Dad to call on me the way he called on Brad. But I wasn't 12. I was 43 years old, and I'd spent the last 2 years cleaning up the messes Brad made behind closed doors. I just never said anything. That's what everyone wanted from me. Silence. Be agreeable, be helpful, be invisible. Even when I was the one writing the damn emails and balancing the quarterly books. Brad got the title, and I got the inbox. That was the arrangement. Until Dad got sick. And even then, nobody really looked my way. Not even when I was the one driving him to chemo, sitting with him in silence while the medicine dripped into his veins. Brad was too busy managing client relations, which meant golfing mostly, and disappearing for days at a time when things got stressful. I waited until most people had filtered out of the main chapel hall, milling into the adjoining room where sandwiches were drying out under plastic wrap. That's when I stood up and walked to the little projector stand near the altar. I could feel eyes on me, especially Mom's, but I didn't meet anyone's gaze. I just reached into my purse and pulled out a small black USB drive. I slid it into the port without saying a word. The projector hummed to life, and the screen blinked white before a familiar signature document filled the wall. People shifted in their seats. At first they thought it was part of the slideshow, maybe some kind of administrative mistake, until they saw the date, less than a week before Dad died. Then the title, Transfer of Ownership Agreement, Carver Mechanical Holdings. A few of the contractors in the back straightened. Brad had stopped talking mid-sentence. He turned slowly, his mouth slightly open, eyes narrowing as if he could will the screen to disappear. But it didn't. Page after page scrolled. Legal documentation, notarized signatures, everything clean and binding. My name was on every single page. And then the video started. It was shot in Dad's hospital room. He looked thin, smaller than I'd ever seen him, but his voice was steady. His eyes were clear. "If you're watching this, I'm gone," he said. "And if Brad has already started talking about taking over, I want to be very clear. I did not leave the company to him. I left it to Emily, because she's the one who earned it. Not by birthright, not by being loud, but by being the one person I could always trust to get it right, even when no one noticed, including me." Gasps. Someone dropped their coffee cup. Mom went pale. Brad took a step forward, but his words got caught somewhere in his throat. I stood still, didn't gloat, didn't smirk, just let the video roll. "I know this might come as a shock," Dad continued, voice softening. "But sometimes the loudest person in the room is just trying to hide how little they understand. Emily, I'm sorry it took me this long to say it out loud." The video faded to black. No music, no slideshow, just silence. I turned to face the room. Half of them looked at me like I'd just pulled off a bank heist. The other half looked at Brad, who was now sweating through his dress shirt, hands clenched at his sides. I didn't have to say much. Just 5 words. Calm and level. "Any questions about that, Brad?" He stared at me like I was someone he'd never seen before. Maybe I was. Maybe for the first time in his life, he was seeing me not as the kid's sister who helped him cheat on his high school math homework, or the girl Dad forgot to introduce at company banquets, but as a threat. A real one. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Then, like a balloon losing air, he turned and walked out of the room, his polished shoes clacking against the floor like a child stomping away from a game he just lost. I didn't follow him, I didn't need to. I knew exactly where he'd go and exactly what he'd try next, and I was ready for it. Because the thing about being underestimated for 43 years is you learn how to play the long game better than anyone else in the room. And I was just getting started. Long before my father's voice played on that projector screen in front of half the town, long before Brad turned red in the face and stormed out like someone had lit a fire. Under his reputation. The real story had already started, and it didn't begin at the funeral, or even when Dad got sick. It began the day I stopped asking for permission and quietly started keeping track of everything Brad let slip through his fingers. It began when I realized I was never going to be handed anything in this family, so if I wanted to survive, I had to build my own map through the minefield and make sure I remembered every step I took. 2 years ago, almost to the day, I got a call from one of the subcontractors who'd worked with our company for over a decade. He was panicked, saying permits hadn't been submitted and the city was threatening to fine us. When I called the office to ask what was going on, Brad's assistant told me he was out of town, networking at a conference in Arizona. That was Brad speak for golf and cheap bourbon with men who still thought contracts were sealed with a handshake and a pat on the back. I drove straight to the office, opened his computer, and what I found made my stomach turn. Dozens of unread emails, missed deadlines, a massive client budget miscalculation, and invoices sitting unpaid. Our father's company wasn't just being mismanaged, it was on the edge of losing contracts. I stayed up for 3 nights straight fixing it. No one knew, not even Dad. I didn't do it for credit. I did it because I couldn't bear the thought of watching everything fall apart because Brad was too busy playing king. That's when I started keeping records. Every mistake, every cover-up, every late invoice I caught and corrected. It wasn't revenge, not yet. It was insurance, and it turned out I'd need it. When Dad was diagnosed, it was like someone finally pulled the plug on his pride. The man who used to bark at us to toughen up now sat in a recliner with hollow eyes, barely able to lift his coffee mug. Brad barely visited. Always had a reason, always an excuse. But I was there, every week, every appointment. I started managing more and more behind the scenes. At first, Dad didn't say much. He just handed me files. Then came the questions. He wanted my opinion. At first, I thought he was just trying to stay involved. But then I realized he was testing me, seeing if I could handle the weight of it. The turning point came one rainy afternoon, the kind of day where the Texas air feels like it's pressing on your skin. Dad was sitting on the porch wrapped in a blanket, looking out at the driveway like he was waiting for something. I asked him what he was thinking about, and after a long silence, he said, "I raised you to believe your job was to support your brother. That was the biggest mistake I ever made." He didn't look at me when he said it, just kept staring at the rain hitting the pavement. I didn't respond with some teary monologue. I didn't try to console him. I just nodded, because I had waited 40 years to hear that, and it felt like too much and not enough all at once. That same week, he told me he wanted to restructure the company and asked if I knew a lawyer who could do it discreetly. I did. And just like that, we started working in the shadows, meetings after doctor visits, legal drafts tucked in manila folders. And always the same promise between us: no drama, no public war. If Brad tried to fight it, we'd let the facts speak for themselves. The paperwork was airtight. I had him record the video 2 weeks before the end, when he still had enough strength to speak clearly and look the camera dead in the eye. He insisted on it. I never showed anyone, not even my closest friend, because when you've grown up being dismissed by the people you share blood with, you learn to keep your weapons sheathed until the moment they're needed most. And you make damn sure they're sharp enough to cut through bone. Back at the funeral, after the video played, I saw Mom's face go blank. Not shocked, just frozen, like someone had kicked out the foundation she'd spent her whole life building. She didn't say a word to me, just turned away. Brad, though, was a different story. I found him outside in the parking lot 10 minutes later, pacing by his car with the engine idling. He looked like someone who'd just gotten mugged. When he saw me, his expression twisted, not angry, confused, as if he couldn't comprehend what had just happened. "You really think this is gonna work?" he asked, voice low but shaking. "You think you can just take it all?" I stepped closer, arms crossed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "I didn't take anything," I said. "I earned it. You were just too busy pretending to notice." He opened his mouth, searching for some comeback, some insult, but nothing came out. Just like in the chapel, because deep down, he knew. He'd known for a long time, and I think that was the worst part for him. Not that he lost, but that he'd underestimated me so completely, so blindly, that he never saw it coming. He drove off without another word, tires screeching like some teenager who didn't get his way. And I stood there, staring at the dust he kicked up, already knowing this was far from over. The ownership was mine now, legally, but I knew Brad. He wasn't going to crawl away and lick his wounds. He was going to come at me sideways. Probably dirty, probably stupid. That was fine. I'd already started keeping a list. The thing about men like Brad, men who've been praised too long and corrected too little, is that they don't take well to losing. Especially not when the person handing them their defeat is the same one they used to brush past in hallways, the sister they never bothered to listen to unless there was something to gain. I knew the blow at the funeral wouldn't be the end. Brad wasn't the type to go quietly, not when he had friends in places that still believed in handshakes behind closed doors and favors over facts. And sure enough, it didn't take long before the fallout started to take shape. Not in explosions, but in quiet little shifts, the kind that smell like sabotage if you've lived around it long enough. The Monday after the funeral, I walked into the office to find the reception desk empty and the phones ringing with no one to answer them. Michelle, the office manager who'd been with us for 8 years, was gone, resigned by email that morning. Her message was cold, polite, and clearly dictated by someone else. The wording was too careful, too professional to be hers. I sat down at my father's old desk, not because I needed to prove anything, but because I had to start somewhere. The office felt off, like the walls were holding their breath, waiting to see what I'd do. 3 more employees quit that same week, 2 foremen and 1 procurement lead, all without warning, all saying they had other opportunities. That's how Brad worked now, not directly, not like a leader, like a spoiled heir slamming drawers closed from the other room. His fingerprints were never visible, but I could feel them on everything, on the sudden coldness of suppliers, on the closed-door meetings that ended when I walked in, on the silence that followed me through the halls. He thought he could choke the business until I gave it back. What he didn't understand was that I had been trained to operate in silence, that I had built my strength under the weight of being ignored. His little campaign of passive aggression didn't scare me. It only confirmed what I already knew, that he wasn't capable of building anything, only of poisoning what he couldn't control. I didn't retaliate, not at first. I listened, I watched. I spent hours going through contracts, checking in with clients, doing the work he had always outsourced to Charm, and a bottle of something expensive. I called every employee who left. Most didn't answer. A few lied. But one, Marcus, one of the foremen, finally cracked. He told me Brad had offered him a position in a new venture, one he was planning to announce in the coming months. Something leaner, more visionary. I could practically hear Brad's voice in the buzzwords. When I asked Marcus why he didn't just tell me, he said, "I didn't think you'd care. You never used to be around." That one hit harder than I expected, but I didn't argue. He wasn't wrong, not entirely. I'd spent years behind the curtain, pulling strings while Brad took bows. Now that I was front and center, people still saw the shadow I used to live in, and Brad was banking on that. On their doubts, on their memories of a version of me that never raised her voice. But what he didn't realize was that silence isn't weakness, it's storage, it's preparation. Still, I knew being right wasn't enough. I had to show them. So I started with the oldest employees, men and women who'd worked with Dad back when the office still smelled like oil and sawdust, not coffee and printer toner. Luis Romero, in particular, was someone I'd known since I was a teenager. Though we'd rarely spoken more than a few sentences, he was quiet, meticulous, and loyal. Not to Brad, not to me, but to the company itself. I brought him into my office, showed him the numbers, laid out the truth, no speeches, no dramatics, just facts. He listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, and when I was done, he said, "It's about time someone remembered what this place is really about." One by one, I did the same with others. Quiet conversations, no pressure, just transparency. And slowly, the tide began to shift. A few who had been hesitant started staying late again. Others who used to avoid me began stopping by to offer updates. It wasn't loyalty, not yet, but it was a beginning. A crack in the wall Brad thought he'd built so tight I'd never get through. But just as things began to steady, another blow came, and this time it was personal. I returned from a site visit one afternoon to find my office door unlocked, slightly ajar. Inside, drawers were pulled open, folders shuffled. Nothing stolen, nothing obvious, just enough to let me know someone had been there. On the desk, sitting right in the middle like a trophy, was my backup USB drive. The same one I thought I'd misplaced a week earlier. It wasn't damaged, but when I plugged it into my laptop, I found several files missing. Files related to the transfer, the legal counsel, Dad's medical records. Gone. Or at least tampered with. I didn't panic. I made a list of what was missing, checked my cloud backups, intact, thank God, and called our cybersecurity firm. Quietly, no announcements. Brad wanted me rattled, wanted me to lash out, to accuse him publicly so he could play the victim. I wouldn't give him that. But I did change the locks, and the passwords, and I moved the most sensitive files off-site. The next morning, a letter from a corporate lawyer arrived. Brad was contesting the transfer of ownership on grounds of undue influence and compromised mental capacity. He was going to try to erase Dad's final decision by painting me as a manipulator, a daughter who took advantage of a sick man to steal a company. It was predictable, it was ugly, and it meant war. I looked at the letter for a long time, the language twisted and clean like poison in a glass of wine. Then I smiled, not because I wanted this fight, but because I was ready for it. Brad thought he was playing chess. What he didn't realize was that I'd already taken his king. He just hadn't noticed the checkmate coming. I made a fresh pot of coffee, sat down at my desk, and opened a blank document. It was time to tell the board what Brad had done 5 years ago, when he quietly siphoned money from company accounts to cover a personal investment that failed miserably, an act I had covered up back then, foolishly thinking I was protecting the family. That cover-up was about to become my next weapon, and Brad, for all his noise and charm, had no idea the storm I was about to bring down. There comes a moment in every long war, whether it's fought with armies or inside the walls of a family home, when you realize the enemy you've been watching isn't the only one aiming at you. I had spent so long keeping my eyes on Brad, documenting his carelessness, anticipating his desperate moves, preparing for every tantrum disguised as a legal strategy, that I almost missed the one person I should have been watching from the start. My mother had always been quiet in that calculating way, the way a locked drawer doesn't make noise, but still holds things sharp enough to wound. Growing up, I thought she was the peacekeeper. Now I understood she was the architect, the one who'd kept the house upright, sure, but also the one who made sure the doors only opened for Brad. It started with the voicemail, a call from my father's old friend and attorney, David Turling, who said in a voice too cautious to be casual, "Emily, I think it's time we talk in person. There's something your mother asked me to hold on to years ago, and, well, it's come up." That alone set off 1,000 alarm bells in my head. David was as old school as they came, never meddled, never whispered. For him to call, for him to break his usual neutrality, meant whatever he had wasn't just a footnote in the family history. It was a landmine someone buried, hoping no one would ever step on it. I drove to his office the next morning, that familiar tan brick building with windows that hadn't been cleaned since the Clinton administration. Inside, David was already waiting with a file on his desk. No small talk, no smiles, just facts. He slid the folder toward me like it was radioactive. "Your mother asked me to keep this out of your father's estate documentation," he said, voice low and even. At the time, I didn't question it. But given the situation, you should know. What I found inside made my skin go cold. It wasn't just a few overlooked forms or a will amendment. It was a series of dated documents going back nearly 3 decades, back when the company was still small, still run out of our garage. Buried in the paperwork were 3 transfers of cash, all traced from company funds to an offshore account in the name of someone I didn't recognize at first, until I read further. The name belonged to a man named Stephen Raymore, and according to the address listed, he had lived in Florida for years. My heart stopped when I realized who he was. He wasn't just some investor. He was the man my mother had once referred to as a long-lost friend from her art school days. She used to say it like a joke, like something from a chapter she barely remembered. But apparently he was a lot more than that. David confirmed what I feared. Those transfers were payments, quiet ones, the kind you make when someone knows something you don't want them to share. In this case, it seemed Stephen had threatened to come forward with evidence of an affair. My mother's affair. And not just a one-time mistake, but a long-running relationship that started before Brad was even born. I stared at the papers for what felt like hours, my mind trying to reconcile every memory I had of family dinners, holiday photos, and those times Dad would come home later than usual, eyes tired, mouth set in a line too tight for words. All that time, I thought he was just worn down from work. Now I wondered if he knew, if he had always known. There was no DNA test in the file, nothing that explicitly spelled it out. But the implication was right there in black and white, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Brad might not have been my father's son, and worse, I don't think Mom ever told him. I left the office in a haze, my thoughts churning so violently, I barely felt the steering wheel beneath my hands. When I got home, I found Mom already waiting on my porch, sitting like she used to when I missed curfew as a teenager, calm, legs crossed, hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't look surprised to see me, didn't even flinch when I held up the file. "You should have burned this," I said, voice quieter than I expected. She looked up at me with those eyes that had always been just a little too cold, too practiced. "I didn't think it mattered anymore," she said. "Walter was gone, and I thought, maybe you just let it lie." "Did he know?" I asked. Her silence was the answer. I sat down across from her, knees suddenly weak, heart hammering in my chest. All this time, I thought Dad's final decision to name me as his successor had come from some late-breaking revelation, some shift in how he saw me. But now I understood there was a deeper truth, one he never spoke. Maybe he had known the truth about Brad all along. Maybe he had played along with the illusion because the alternative would have shattered the family. And maybe when he realized he was dying, he decided to finally do what was right. Not just for the company, but for Ma. It explained so much. The way he looked at Brad in those final months, the way he started relying on me, not just out of necessity, but with trust. It also explained why Brad had always been treated like the heir, no matter how reckless, no matter how careless. Maybe Mom pushed for it because he was hers, in every way. Because if the truth ever surfaced, everything she built, her image, her marriage, her place in the community, would come crumbling down. I didn't tell her what I planned to do next. I didn't threaten her. There was no point. Whatever fight we might have had in that moment had already been fought and lost years ago in secrets and decisions that couldn't be undone. But I did leave with a new understanding, one that settled over me like armor. The war with Brad wasn't just about the company. It was about inheritance, yes, but not the kind you put in a will. It was about the things passed down in silence, the lies, the favoritism, the roles we were forced to play, and the cost of stepping out of them. That night, I opened the second video Dad had left me, the one labeled Emily Private, which I hadn't watched yet because some part of me feared it might undo the strength I'd been clinging to. But when I pressed play and saw his face again, tired but clear, I listened as he told the story of a financial cover-up that happened 5 years ago, one Brad was responsible for, and one I had unknowingly helped fix when I bailed the company out of a debt I was never told the source of. He knew, he'd always known. "I'm sorry I didn't stop it then," Dad said in the video, eyes heavy. "I should have stood up for you a long time ago, but I'm doing it now, and I hope you can forgive me for being so damn late." I sat there in the dark long after the screen faded to black. Not crying, not shaking, just still. Forgiveness wasn't what I was focused on anymore. I was focused on finishing what he started. The day of the board meeting arrived without ceremony, without storm clouds, without any sign that what was about to happen would shift the foundation of everything our family had built, defended, and lied about for the last 35 years. The morning sun shone as though it didn't care, the sky stayed wide and cloudless, and the city moved on around me as I stood at the front doors of Carver Mechanical Holdings in a gray blazer that had once belonged to my father. It didn't fit quite right in the shoulders, and that was exactly why I wore it. I wanted to feel the weight of him one last time, wanted to wear the fabric he used to wear when he walked into this building and was greeted with respect, fear, and the kind of deference that's never spoken aloud, but always felt. The difference was when I stepped through those glass doors, nobody stood waiting. I didn't expect anyone to. The boardroom smelled like dust and lemon polish, the table long and lacquered, surrounded by men whose names had been in the company registry since I was a teenager, sneaking into meetings with coffee trays just to hear how real decisions were made. They were already seated when I entered, murmuring amongst themselves in those low tones used by people who think the real conversation should happen before the woman in charge walks in. At the head of the table sat Harold Jennings, our legal counsel and family friend, who looked exhausted, like this meeting was a burden he'd rather not carry. I took the seat across from him without waiting to be offered one. I didn't need their permission to sit at my own table. Brad arrived late, of course, flanked by his lawyer, a sleek, overconfident man in an overpriced suit who already looked too pleased with himself, as if the outcome had been sealed somewhere over a steak dinner with one of the more easily influenced board members. Brad wore the same smug expression I had seen so many times in our childhood, the one he wore when he lied and got away with it, when he won games he didn't understand the rules of, when he talked louder than everyone else and assumed volume meant victory. The meeting began with pleasantries none of us believed in. Harold outlined the agenda, citing the recent dispute over ownership and Brad's formal request for a board review of the transfer process. The lawyer presented their case first, arguing undue influence, claiming I had manipulated our father in his weakened state, painting a portrait of a grieving daughter who had taken advantage of an old man's vulnerability. The narrative was thin, desperate, but dressed up in enough legalese to give it the appearance of legitimacy. I didn't interrupt. I didn't flinch. I waited until he was finished, then asked Harold if I could show a few files of my own. He nodded, hesitantly, and I reached into the folder I had prepared with the kind of care people usually reserve for bomb defusal. I handed each board member a copy of financial documents, evidence of Brad's embezzlement from 5 years ago, traced accounts, cover letters, and statements. Then I played the second video. My father's face appeared on the screen again, this time in sharper light, his voice a little weaker but unmistakably lucid. He explained without hesitation how Brad had diverted funds from the company to cover a bad investment, how the discrepancy had nearly jeopardized a city contract, how I had unknowingly saved the company by fixing the numbers and never asking questions. The room went completely silent, the kind of silence you don't just hear. You feel it pressing against your skin, settling over your shoulders like snowfall in an empty field. No one looked at Brad. No one dared. He didn't speak. He didn't even breathe loudly. I could see his mind scrambling for a way out, for a new lie, for something to say that would make this all go away. But for once there was nothing. No charm, no swagger, no convenient scapegoat to deflect blame. Just the truth, echoing off the walls he used to call his own. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply looked around the table and said, "This isn't about revenge. This is about responsibility. My father trusted me to run this company because I've already been doing it for years." He just finally said it out loud before he died. There was a vote. It wasn't close. Brad was removed from the board. The lawyer gathered his things without a word, and Brad followed him, his face red with something I couldn't quite name. Shame, maybe, or just the sting of losing in a room full of people who used to cheer for him. When the room was nearly empty, Harold leaned forward and asked me what came next. He looked tired, but also curious, like he couldn't tell if I was about to crown myself queen or walk away from the throne. I surprised him, and maybe myself, when I said, "I'm not going to be the face of the company. I'll stay owner, but I want someone else running the day-to-day. Someone who knows the floors better than he knows the shareholders." 2 days later, I promoted Luis Romero to president. He didn't thank me with a speech. He just nodded, rolled up his sleeves, and asked what I needed from him first. That's how I knew I'd made the right call. He didn't want the spotlight. He wanted the work. As for me, I took an office in the back, where I could still see the parking lot and hear the crews starting up their trucks in the early morning. I still came in every day, still signed checks, still kept an eye on the books, but I let the company become what it needed to be without my name stamped on every inch of it. I didn't need a throne. I just needed peace. And yet, there was one final thing I did before closing that chapter for good. I mailed a copy of the documents, the paternity records I had quietly ordered, and the financial proof of the affair to my mother. No note, no explanation, just the truth, neatly bound. Delivered to the same house she used to scold me in for being too quiet, too stubborn, too much like my father. I never got a response. But then again, silence runs in our blood. People often say revenge is loud, that it comes with explosions, shouting, broken glass. But the kind of revenge that lasts, the kind that leaves marks deep enough to echo through generations, doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't scream. It simply walks into the quietest room in the building, plugs in a USB drive, and lets the truth do the talking. And that's exactly what I did.